So this month, we are so happy to have with us Stephanie Ternullo. Stephanie is an assistant professor of government at Harvard, and she recently wrote this book called How the Heartland Went Red, Why Local Forces Matter in an Age of Nationalized Politics, which is right up Ruby's alley. So we're so interested in hearing about Stephanie's book. And I will say no more. Let's spend all our time hearing from Stephanie and then having a conversation. Stephanie, thanks so much for being here, and you can get started now.
Great. Thank you all so much for having me. Thank you for being here. As I will tell you a little bit more about in a minute, I wrote this book after talking to a lot of folks who live in three communities in the Midwest. A lot of really civically and politically engaged people in those communities who kind of told me what their problems were and how they were trying to address them. My understanding is that's a lot of the audience here today. So basically from conversations with, I think, people like you, I was able to write this book. So hopefully I'll be able to tell you something new here. But if not, we can talk about it more in the Q&A. But either way, I'm really, really grateful to be here having this conversation with you. So as Erica said, the title of my book is How the Heartland Went Red, Why Local Forces Matter in an Age of Nationalized Politics. And you can see here already why it has that title. So on the left, you're looking at a map of all of the counties that could be considered part of the white working class New Deal coalition in the 1930s and 40s. So these were counties that were whose economies were sort of grounded in industrial and agricultural output, and who were swept into this new Democratic Party coalition during the Great Depression, when the Democrats for the first time were implementing all of these social welfare policies and all of this legislation to support organized labor. And they became, for the first time, really the party of the worker. And they attracted all of these new voters across what we can think of as the industrial heartland, right? And I think for a lot of folks, when we even ask the question of why are workers not voting Democrat today, we're thinking back to this era, this time when that was the norm, right? As you can see on the right, by the 2016 election, the vast majority of those counties were no longer voting blue. They had turned red, and they're shaded red in this map only if they were sort of voting reliably Republican by the 2016 election. So these weren't just counties that flitted over to Donald Trump and maybe came back. These were counties that had, by 2016, made a pretty big shift over to the right. And so that ends up being 96% of that original 467 blue counties from the other side of the screen. But they didn't all turn to the right at the same time, and they didn't all turn to the right for the same reasons. So what you're looking at here is a figure that summarizes the three different sort of groups of political trajectories from that set of counties I just showed you. So on the x-axis, you have election year, and on the y-axis, you have the average Democratic presidential vote share of each group. And the dashed horizontal gray line is the 50% mark. So anything above that line, pretty Democratic. Below that line, more Republican. And what you can see in the bright red line is this group of counties that sort of in the late 1960s kind of took a hard turn to the right and have stayed that way ever since. So that represents about 2/3 of those original Heartland New Deal Democratic counties. Already by the late 60s, early 70s, those communities were sort of lost to the Democratic Party. And then in the green line, we can see another set of counties that was at least competitive to both parties all the way up until the 2016 election. And then they took a hard turn to the right with that 2016 election. And that represented about 11% of those original counties that we saw. And then finally, we can see in the blue line a group of counties that has remained in the Democratic coalition throughout this whole period. This is just 4% of those original counties. So they're outliers. They've kind of bucked the trend of the heartland turning red, as the title of my book suggests. And so one question we might ask is, how did they buck that trend? What made this group of counties into these this outlier set of cases, these cases that have remained the Democratic coalition all this time. So to answer this question in the book, I focus on just three communities that are representative of these broader trends in heartland politics. So first, so all three of these communities were part of that original blue map that I showed you. So these were all sort of overwhelmingly white industrial cities that had once been part of the Democratic coalition. And then we have the first city, Lutherton, Indiana, which turned to the right sort of in the late 1960s and even further to the right in the early 2000s. So they represent, that big group of about 2/3 of those counties. And those two sort of shifts in Lutherton's politics mirror really broad changes in American politics in the way that race and religion became incorporated into the national political parties. And I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A or really at any time. And then we have Gravesend, Minnesota. Gravesend, Minnesota is one of those green line cases. So they were competitive to both Democrats and Republicans all the way up until 2016. Took a hard turn to the right. And then finally, we have Motorville, Wisconsin, which is one of those rare cases that is still voting Democratic today. And so before you all start Googling, these are all pseudonyms, so they're fake names, real states. I did that to protect the anonymity of the folks who spoke to me to make this book possible. But yeah, so what I'm gonna talk about for most of this talk is trying to understand, as the title of the slide suggests, why did Motorville stay blue? And I'm going to compare it briefly to Gravesend because I think this comparison is probably most relevant for the conversation today. One argument I make in the book is that those 2/3 of Democratic counties that turned to the right in the late 1970s, that's not a trend that any sort of present day political force is likely to reverse. It's been sort of sunk into those communities' politics and ways of being for decades and decades, right? But Gravesend, Minnesota, a community that has only so recently turned to the right, thinking about why they've turned to the right when Motorville has stayed Democratic, that can help us start thinking more about sort of the contemporary causes of this rightward shift and what might be done to sort of mitigate that turn. Right, so the question for us today is, why did Motorville stay blue? Before I give you the answer, I just want to tell you a little bit more about how I reached the conclusions in my research so you can kind of decide for yourselves if you want to buy what I'm selling here. So the sort of crux of my argument comes from over 300 interviews I conducted with a group of 86 residents across those three communities during the 18 months leading up to the 2020 presidential election. So I interviewed each of those people 4 times. So on average, I spoke to them for 4.5 hours each. So I spent a fair amount of time with this group of people. And this included sort of several months of the COVID-19 pandemic, which you all probably remember from 2020. In addition to that, I was able to spend about 6 months of time in person across the three communities. I plan to spend more, but because of the pandemic, I was unable to leave my immediate vicinity. And then I also interviewed 91 additional community leaders. So these were folks who were elected officials, people who led nonprofits, pastors, labor leaders, party activists, those really civically and politically engaged people that I mentioned at the top. I also collected archival newspaper data going back to 1932, as well as all of the publicly available Facebook posts from local politicians, all the way down from city council up through U.S. House of Representatives. Okay, so from all of these efforts, what did I find? I want to start by giving you a sort of insight into what democratic politics looks like today in Motorville. This is from a conversation I had with Isaac. Isaac is a lifelong Democrat. He grew up in Motorville. He's also a union member. He has a fantastic, very well-paid union job. And when I talked to him in summer 19, I asked him, he's not in elected office. He doesn't plan to run for elected office, but I asked him what his platform would be if he ever were to consider running for local office. And he said the following, quote, "I would hope for a balanced budget, but that would be paid for with probably higher taxes on more of the higher income people and less on the middle class and obviously on poor people. making sure that the elderly don't go bankrupt and have to make a choice between food and medicine. I mean, making things more affordable. So Isaac's comments here are indicative of the way he views not just local government, but also the state and federal government. He thinks the government is a force that can be used to redistribute from using higher taxes on higher income people to make sure that lower income folks and the elderly don't have to make choices between food and medicine, right? And I'm showing you this quote because it's indicative of a broader worldview that I heard from a lot of the Motorvillians that I spoke to. More generally, they tended to tell me that economic inequality is sort of the central challenge facing the country today. And they also think that that inequality is negatively affecting them and their community. Moreover, they think of the Democratic Party as the party that is going to help start redressing some of these inequities by bringing in the state and federal governments to level the playing field through some of the kind of redistributive practices that Isaac was alluding to. So that's what democratic politics looks like in Motorville today. But I think the more interesting and important question for us all is why? Why do people in Motorville still think of the government as this sort of useful force, this force that can help them, when we know that in a lot of rural and post-industrial communities, many people feel sort of left behind by their state and federal governments. They feel that those governments are prioritizing other groups of people, often urban residents, at their expense. So why do Isaac and other Motorvillians think about government in this positive light? So my argument is that local organizations are a really big part of the answer. And in particular, in the case of Motorville, the local organizations that matter most are organized labor. Motorville is a union town. It's a place where unions are still fighting economic battles on political terrain. Now, that argument might sound sort of very old-fashioned to a lot of people in this room who are probably well aware of the fact that we've been experiencing decades and decades of union decline in this country. And that is also true of Motorville, particularly because it's in Wisconsin, a state where a Republican governor, Scott Walker, for several years made union busting a priority and passed two pieces of legislation, Right to Work and Act 10, that had devastating consequences for union density throughout the state and including in Motorville. But despite all of these sort of adverse consequences of state legislation, as well as deindustrialization, Motorville has been able to retain sort of these core components of a labor movement that have really impacted local politics. So they still have a local labor council. The labor council is the lowest geographic unit of the AFL-CIO, which is the sort of national labor organization in the United States. And the labor council does two things. It collects all of the leaders of various different local unions in a room. So you can have the postal service workers in the same room as the electricians and the nurses. And they talk about issues specific to Motorville that affect one or all members of the group. And then they talk about issues affecting the broader labor movement. And what this does is remind people that union membership is about more than just you're working your job, right? That you're protecting your own job and you're getting services from the union vis-a-vis your employer, but that union membership is about politics because you're part of this broader working class political movement, that what happens to the nurses in your community matters, even if you're an electrician, and that you're willing to support them. And you also care about industrial action going on in other states. And so this organization sort of imposes politics into the local labor movement in these really important ways. And they also endorse candidates for local elected office. And this turns out to be really important because this is a pretty small city of just about 25,000 residents. And so even though organized labor is no longer as sort of powerful as it once was, it's still kind of the only game in town. As a lot of you probably know, local elections in the US are overwhelmingly nonpartisan. And so the political parties aren't involved. And when I interviewed elected officials in Motorville, they basically explained the only organized groups that they could turn to for help when they wanted to run for office were the unions. So they're the only game in town. And at the time my fieldwork started in 2019, there was a lot of evidence that their efforts had been successful. 4 of the city councilors were also labor leaders. These were folks who showed up in those labor council meetings that I attended. A 5th was elected with labor support, as was the mayor, right? And so they were succeeding in helping elect officials to office. And even if their support wasn't crucial to getting those folks elected, the fact that councilors believed that organized labor was this big political power player in town meant that they tended to listen to labor's point of view. The result was that they would try to pass policies that reflected the needs and perspectives of the labor movement. And we can see this here in a conversation I had with Mark, who's a former city councilor. And Mark was involved in this sort of dramatic effort in the early 2000s to ratify a local municipal workers contract after a piece of state legislation sort of threatened their collective bargaining rights. And he told me that although it was kind of dramatic, it was pretty much a common sense move on his part because, quote, Motorville is a blue dog Democrat type town. So the working class labor people, union type people. And so the unions very much wanted somebody that was going to be in there that was going to support the labor side completely. So I supported whatever they want, not like blindly following them, but more, I agree with that. So the consequence of organized labor's routine engagement in local politics is that they elect folks like Mark, for folks who agree with them. And this means that community leaders across Motorville tend to agree with labor's point of view. They think that the city's challenges are rooted in these systemic economic inequalities that require systemic political solutions, largely from the government. They need extra local government intervention to help address their problems. The result is that even folks who live in Motorville but don't have direct union ties tend to share Isaac's worldview. And we can see that here in a conversation I had with Danielle. Danielle also lives in Motorville. She is a former union member. She actually doesn't even really like unions that much, but she really articulates a similar perspective to what we heard from Isaac. I asked her what she would change about the country if she had a magic wand, and she tells me she's really concerned about inequality because, quote, I feel like everybody's struggling, except maybe the very, very top tier. And that's a huge issue in our country as well, which kind of all of our issues come from that. We could have better healthcare, we could have better housing. So for Danielle, like a lot of Motorvillians I spoke to, these big economic inequalities position this broad group of people who are quote unquote struggling against the very, very top tier. She imagines herself and basically everybody she knows within that group of struggling people. And so she imagines herself and everybody she knows as benefiting if the government were to intervene and provide things like better healthcare and better housing. But for this sort of worldview to really lead to an attachment to the Democratic Party, people in Motorville have to think that Democrats are going to be the people to use the government to provide these kinds of resources for the benefit of folks like Danielle. And for the most part, they really do. The people I talk to in Motorville tend to agree that Democrats are the party of the disadvantaged. As Tanya here tells me when I ask her what she thinks the Democratic Party stands for, she thinks they're the party of human services, giving people what they need. And Republicans stand for the idea that, quote, people with more opportunities get more opportunities. So the Republicans are not for people like Tanya and other folks in Motorville who are among the struggling. Okay, so that's sort of this outlier case, this case of a rare instance in which a post-industrial community is struggling with all of the challenges that we know these kinds of communities deal with, including population and economic decline, that folks in this kind of community are still thinking of the federal government as a force that can help them, and they're thinking of the Democrats as the party that will use that force to help them, right? So now I'm going to take you to Gravesend. Gravesend is that community that just recently turned to the right in 2016, and residents there, like residents in Motorville, are deeply concerned with a lot of the same sort of consequences of these systemic inequalities in the current economic system, right? They're worried that people don't have good enough jobs to make ends meet. They're worried about the losses that their community has faced. In fact, as I write about in the book, they feel that their community is dying. It's basically on the verge of extinction. And yet they think about the federal government in a very, very different way. They do not think the government is there to help them. And in fact, they think it might even hurt them. So Scott offers us an example of this. Scott was a lifelong Democrat. He had a formative political experience when he was young. He got into a dispute with his uncle, who was also his boss, when he was a construction worker. And the union really represented him in that dispute. And he sort of, felt like that's what politics is. It's the workers against the bosses, right? This was up until 2016 when he voted for Donald Trump, his first Republican presidential vote ever. And by 2020, he was considering himself a Republican because, as he explained, quote, the Democratic Party has definitely changed. Used to be Democrat farmer labor. And the Republicans was more business. You know what I'm getting at? Just like me with my old boss. And now it's gotten more where the Democratic Party has gotten for more of a giveaway thing, by letting all these illegals in and all this kind of stuff. And so Scott, facing very similar conditions in his community as to those that Danielle and Tanya and Isaac are feeling, rather than looking to the government as this force that's going to help them resolve those challenges, he thinks of the Democratic Party as this organization that's actually going to use the federal government for quote unquote giveaways to quote unquote all these illegals. And so it's actually this malevolent force that's going to make his life worse rather than better. And I think that Scott's view is actually more indicative of a much broader trend across these kinds of heartland communities, in large part because of the decline of organized labor. So real quick, I'll just make one last point and then I'll open it up for comments and questions. So a lot of what I talked about today about what's going on with Motorville politics, one way to think about it is that people in Motorville still view political divisions as rooted in class divisions, that it's the struggling versus the 1%, the workers versus the businesses, the way that Scott doesn't think about politics anymore, right? And we might worry that that way of thinking about politics could be exclusionary of other racial groups, of different genders, that kind of thing. But for the people that I spoke to, it largely wasn't. For them, this way of thinking about the Democratic Party as the party representing people who are disadvantaged by systemic inequalities made them think that the Democrats were this broad coalition representing, as Isaac says here, everybody, not the 1%, but everybody, white people, black people, brown people, everybody. And they stand for the middle class and for workers. And then they think of the Republican Party as, quote, old, rich, white people. Okay, so finally, just to wrap up, what I think that we can potentially learn from this research really relies on us thinking about Motorville as this outlier case, this kind of old-fashioned anachronistic case where organized labor is still really politically mobilized, still really engaged in local politics, and still reminding people that their jobs are really a political proposition. And the very fact that it's such an outlier that only 4% of those original counties are still voting Democratic today suggests the likely role of organized labor's decline in producing the shift to the right across the heartland, but also the potential for organized labor to be a source for revitalizing a kind of cross-racial working class politics in these communities. All right, I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions. So if folks want to raise their hands or put questions in the chat, we will get to as many as we possibly can. Let me just kick off with one quick one that, because you mentioned that the local unions tended to focus on local issues and labor movement issues. And I'm assuming that means that they didn't focus much on kind of the hot button national cultural issues, or did they ever do any kind of political education on some of those issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can't necessarily speak to what everyone did internally within their organizations, within each union local. I'm talking to a couple people who were involved as like the political action folks in their locals. They tended to focus on legislation in the state and federal governments that were relevant to the union. Within that local labor council, it was very much, as you said, about organized labor, what was going on in local city government that impacted organized labor or state government. Um, they did get involved in elections, in electoral politics, and endorsing candidates, as I said, for local and state office. Um, but they didn't bring up sort of when I was there things like gun control or abortion, if that's sort of your question. However, and I think that there were actually sort of strategic efforts by some members of the community, community leaders, to kind of sidestep those issues, particularly one common sort of trade-off that gets posed in these communities is a trade-off between like jobs and the environment, particularly Motorville. One of its biggest employers is part of an extractive industry. And so if you're a Democrat and an environmentalist, which their mayor was, you might have a lot of concerns about sort of the foundation of the economy being in an extractive industry. But he was very, very, very careful, as were other elected officials, to not let that trade-off become central to local politics. He did not want to have debate about environment versus jobs. He took for granted that in this community, the most important thing was to protect the good jobs, to protect the good union jobs, and those other kind of considerations had to be sort of secondary to local politics. So I think there was a deliberate effort to avoid some of those issues for sure.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's see. Jacob, go ahead and unmute yourself.
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks, Erica. Stephanie, thank you. And thanks everyone for giving me a chance to ask a question. My name is Jacob Brooks. I'm from Ennis, North Carolina, which is up in the mountains. I am a lawyer and also an organizer in the state of North Carolina. Stephanie, my question is, in the work that I have done, and then also growing up, in rural America, particularly in Appalachia, and I'll use this disclaimer really quick to say, folks, please do not let J.D. Vance be your only impression of the Appalachian region. When in 2016, my grandfather, who has since passed, was a Vietnam vet, and he said he was going to vote for either Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders. And I am just curious in this general chat of like, what does the Democratic Party need to do, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know that this moderate voter that they think is out there actually exists. I am curious what your takeaway is, because thinking about Isaac's platform is pretty similar to a Bernie Sanders platform. And so this general undertow that I think has bubbled up with the new party chair, Ben Winkler, that it's like, we've got to get back to the middle. I don't know that that's true. And I was curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It's nice to meet you, Jacob. So the way I think about it, I mean, I totally agree with you. I don't think that the folks in Motorville are moderates in sort of the way I think maybe Ben Winkler means. I think that we have to think about like different kinds of issues on like different spectrums, right? So when it comes to issues of like redistribution that Isaac is talking about, I think they're pretty far to the left in Motorville. And I think to your point, a lot of people could be brought pretty far to the left in some of these communities. In my most Republican case, which I didn't talk about at all today, I had several conversations with this group of older gentlemen who meet weekly for coffee in the local Burger King. And we talked a lot about healthcare in the summer of 2019. And people were surprisingly open. These are diehard Republicans, surprisingly open to something like a Bernie Sanders Medicare for All type proposal, because they were so deeply concerned about the cost of healthcare in this country. And so I think that as soon as we put party labels on issues, it can turn people off. Like if you're a diehard Republican, you don't really want to hear what the Democrats have to say. If you're a diehard Democrat, you don't really want to hear what the Republicans have to say. But I was blown away, to your point, in that first summer of talking to folks by just how similar people's like concerns were about American politics, how worried they were about inequality, how worried they were about the lack of resources for people they knew, people in their communities, and wanting someone to really address those concerns in a way that I don't think is moderate at all. Now, they might be more moderate on something like gun control, to Erica's point, but they're certainly not moderate on redistributive issues. The difference, I think, what makes the difference between a Democrat and a Republican is that they might share that same concerns. They might say, I had this long conversation with one of my favorite interviewees I'm still in contact with today. And he is so worried about economic inequality. He's really worried for his grandkids and their future in America. But he has a different sort of solution, right? So Scott also worried about economic inequality, but he doesn't think the government is the solution. He thinks the government is part of the problem. Isaac thinks the government is the solution. So I think that's where the disconnect is. And that actually comes prior to party politics in a way. It's about trying to convince people that government involvement in healthcare actually could make healthcare better for people, when a lot of people are afraid and worried that the government hasn't helped them and never will, and actually tends to help other people at their expense. I think that's one of the huge challenges in bridging some of those gaps, because people are worried about the same stuff. We all live in the same world, right?
Thanks. Thanks for the question, Jacob. I'm going to go to Karen Brown.
Hi, my name is Karen, and I am calling in. I live in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Michigan studying for my PhD. And I really appreciated the presentation, so thank you so much. And I'm really curious because the University of Michigan has a very active graduate student union that I'm a member of, and so I'm really interested in what you talked about in the role of unions in shaping people's political views of those you interviewed and those you spoke to. And in particular, I'm curious because we saw in the last presidential election, I think it was Sean O'Brien, the head of the Teamsters, didn't endorse either candidate. And we have seen that there are like some union members who think that like the cultural or social issues are more important than the economic issues. And so it's just making me wonder, like, or it's making me think that unions are not necessarily the answer, or they're like not the silver bullet. So my question for you is, like, do you think it's unions in combination with other things that influence how people identify with political parties, or maybe it's like certain kinds of unions, like local versus national unions? I'd be curious to hear more about how you think about that. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for that question. So, unions are one among many things that, I mean, I think when we all reflect on our own experience and why we identify with one political party versus the other, it's like clear there's a lot of reasons, right? Unions are, I think, one of them, one key piece of the explanation in this particular context. But what you said at the end is like spot on, which is that it's not all unions, right? And there has actually been, prior, like before I was born, actually, people had been writing about this shift in the labor movement from really, there were only a couple decades where organized labor in the US was really actively involved in the kind of politics I'm talking about. So organizing new members into unions, and then once they were there, kind of trying to teach them before, not about Democratic and Republican politics, but about how political engagement in general could benefit them and their economic position, right? And that was sort of a key role of unions for many years, but it hasn't been for a long time. And so for several decades now, unions have, partly because they've lost so many resources, they haven't been focused on this kind of political engagement, and they're also not doing as much on the front of organizing new members into or organizing new shops or plants. And so for the most part, the kinds of unions that I'm seeing in Motorville are pretty rare today. And I think that's why they have these kinds of rare consequences. And in fact, one thing that I talk about a bit in the book is that union members I interviewed in my other two cities sounded very, very different from union members in Motorville. They tended to view union membership as more of like an insurance policy, right? Like, I'm a teacher. If a kid twist their ankle in class and then the parents try to come after me, my union will represent me. And so I won't get fired for this, commonplace mishap. That is not a political union at all. That is what some people have referred to as a business union. That's really just focused on this employer-employee relationship. Now, I think that is super, super important. I think one of the primary roles, if we can think of labor as historically having two roles, one was representing workers and building worker power in negotiations vis-a-vis their employer. But the other primary role they historically had was building working class politics, mobilizing workers into the electorate and kind of giving them the information about how different kinds of politics would affect them economically. And they really have stopped doing that for the most part.
Okay, Brian Hager, we're going to go to you.
Thank you. So key question for me is kind of the chicken and egg on this union and the social organizing, because you describe a strong union environment in Motor City. Was there a similar size union? Was there similar size industrial activities in the other communities? And so, and one of the things I want to get to on that is kind of the bowling alone type of hypothesis, that the social connections, when people feel socially connected in the community, they are more willing to step out and work with the community to make things better versus the hyper individualism that was promoted for the last 60 years. And I just wanted to know if you've looked at those factors within this comparison.
Yes, that is a hugely important question. So thank you for that, Brian. Yeah, so all three of these communities kind of, I would say, had varying degrees of like a post-industrial transition. So some loss of manufacturing and industrial employment between the 70s and the early 2000s. All three communities during that New Deal era I talked about, when the Democrats implemented all of these policies to support organized labor, all three communities built active labor movements at that time. The shift really happened sort of in the 70s and 80s, where my most Republican field site basically decided they didn't want organized labor anymore. Their largest employer left town, and there was this rumor circulating in the local editorial pages that they left town in search of cheaper labor. They moved down south, where organized labor has been historically very, very weak in the American Southeast because of labor leaders in the South did not believe in cross-racial organizations. And so there's basically been no unions in the Southeast. So manufacturers often move south because there are no unions, so workers are cheaper. So this was the rumor. And in this Republican case, a new employer came in, took over that same plant, and they re-employed hundreds of the same workers that had been employed by that old employer. And the UAW came back in, the same union came back in and tried to reorganize those same workers twice. And they failed both times. So after that town had had a local labor council. It disappeared within a few years. The whole region, the whole set of counties in Indiana had lost any sort of labor council within 10 years of that event. And so that town actually has the most industrial employment of all three of my cities. They have the most sort of like foundation for unionization of any of my three cities. But it's a community that actually today prides itself on not being a union town. Like community leaders would tell me repeatedly, we use this as a selling point when we're trying to attract investment, which is totally the opposite of the case in Motorville, right? Where community leaders there, as I said, are very much tied into the labor movement and view protecting good union jobs as like one of their key objectives. And so there's totally a chicken and egg thing here. And I could take this story all the way back to, the 1880s and 1890s with these cases. One key part of the story for sure is how bad deindustrialization hit them. Another key part of the story is the choices that people were making about whether they wanted union representation. And part of the reason I argue in the book that Motorville continually has sort of prioritized organized labor is that by the time deindustrialization started to affect them, they already had an almost century-long tradition of militant labor mobilization. And so it was kind of built into the culture then as it is now to protect organized labor, both politically and on the shop floor. And so I think that's super important. Your point about Bob Putnam's work, I think, is also a really important one. So in the city that I didn't really talk much about today, they voted out the Union in the 1970s, but that town isn't devoid of associational life. It's not devoid of these social connections. They're actually a deeply connected community. They're just connected through churches. And that produces a totally different set of politics, which I talk a lot about in the book. And so there are these two cases that I have, one where these unions are tying people together and this leads to a democratic politics, one where churches are tying people together, that leads to a Republican politics. And then in this Gravesend case, what's happened there is really the Bob Putnam story you're talking about, which is a kind of complete deterioration of civil society organizations in the community. And that doesn't just lead to sort of this hyper individualization you're talking about, but I argue that it leads to exacerbate those feelings of loss. Like I said, in Scottstown, a lot of people feel like their community is on the verge of extinction. And they're looking for someone to say, here's what we should do, right? But because they lack these civil society organizations that exist in my other two communities, where churches and unions are saying, here's what we should do, this is what the problem is, this is the solution, they're getting even more frustrated. So residents constantly say things like, we have no leadership here locally. Like, we've had this problem for years and years and years, and no one has done anything. They feel abandoned. And that sort of feeling of threat and abandonment is what sort of brought them into the Republican coalition in 2016.
Let me add one additional comment about Indiana. It had the largest Ku Klux Klan activity outside of the old Confederacy in the country. It was a real hotbed for that kind of anti-immigrant and anti-Black organizing throughout the last century.
Absolutely. And also sundown towns were a kind of major, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, what Brian was raising is such a central question and problem for us at Ruby, and I want to plug a couple things. One is, at some point in the next few months at one of our briefings, we're going to have one of the authors of Rust Belt Union Blues, which I'm sure is a book Stephanie's really familiar with, but it really goes into the problem of what happens when the labor movement declines and the unions are gone and all that's left in a community are either the gun clubs, the churches, or nothing, and how that fraying of the civic infrastructure has such devastating political consequences. So we are going to definitely be looking at that more. Stay tuned for that. This is also a really good time for me to mention, for those of you who are new to Ruby, we have a program called Community Works, where we partner with usually local Democratic parties at the county level and potentially other local groups too, to try and have an ongoing presence where people who are perceived as, liberals are active in the community doing good neighborly charitable service work in the community. And it kind of ties into this effort of trying to rebuild and repair what has been lost in so many communities that are in decline. And Meredith just posted there, Meredith's director of our Community Works program, and she just posted, we have a monthly kind of orientation for people who want to learn more about Community Works and potentially explore turning your community into a hotbed of goodness. So there's the link there. You can sign up to attend one of our future briefings. Okay, I do see the hands. I'm gonna, for a moment, go over to Anthony and ask if you can mention one or two of the questions from the chat, and then we will go back to the raised hands.
Thanks, Erica. Yeah, I'm gonna combine a couple of questions for the first one, and then there's a distinctly different one for the second. There's a whole bunch. Two people asked questions basically of a what can we do nature. Michael asked, is it possible for the Democratic Party to walk and chew gum at the same time? This is something Ruby is always talking about. And he says that is to speak to organized labor and rural voters, and at the same time stand up for marginalized people. So that's kind of a question, how that, somewhat related to that, Lynn has asked just more broadly, what can small town liberals, she phrased it, do to either keep their communities from turning red or get them back to blue, particularly if unionization is not a realistic answer in the short to medium term. So sort of two kinds of what can we do questions.
Both great questions. So the first one, I think that the quote I showed you very, very briefly at the end, that second quote from Isaac and our conversation about how he views the two parties, I think that tells us that the Democrats can walk and chew gum at the same time, if I understand your meaning of that phrase, which is to say that I think that there is a worldview that exists, which is that there's broad inequalities. They're hitting a lot of us. There's, the 1% are doing great. They're currently in control of the federal government, for example. They just keep getting richer and richer, and everyone else is struggling. That is a worldview that I think is rooted in this kind of like economic inequality, but it can be expanded to encompass people of different races and genders, right? And different ethnicities, people who are disadvantaged in that system in slightly different ways, but kind of grappling with the similar challenges of making ends meet, of, wanting to make sure that if their kid is sick, that they can get health care without going bankrupt. Like, those are concerns that apply to a really broad range of people. And I think that if you have the worldview that Isaac has, which is that these are sort of broad inequalities, they're affecting me and a lot of people like me. The other thing he recognizes is that there's other parts of that system that aren't affecting him, right? He's a white man. And so he recognizes that people of color are experiencing different kinds of challenges in that unequal system, and that those can also be addressed without negatively impacting him. He thinks about all of those people as working together to kind of create more equality along all of these dimensions of class, race, and gender. I think that's a really, really tall order for organized labor to achieve, to get to the second question. And like, how else could you achieve that if you don't have unions? For example, if you are in the Southeast where there really have never been unions, or if you are in this city of mine, Indiana, which hasn't really had unions since the 1970s, like, you're not going to get them back at this point. So what can you do in that case? I think one of the maybe rays of hope that I saw in Gravesend, which is that town that sort of just turned to the right in 2016, and actually in all of my field sites, is that every single town I visited has this like group of, really like smart, passionate, dedicated people. I think all of you in this room who want to kind of create that kind of civic infrastructure, and they want to address these challenges and these problems in their community. And I think it's really important actually to do a lot of that work in nonpartisan ways, because like I said before, party labels can turn people off. I mean, I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we react sometimes differently to people who present themselves as a Republican or Democrat, depending on if we're a Republican or Democrat, right? And so doing nonpartisan work that involves kind of building a civic infrastructure. And what I mean by that is like a regular set of organizations. So what the unions and the churches are doing in Motorville and in Lutherton is that they're involved in like regular citywide or countywide meetings where they talk about social problems and how to address them. During the COVID-19 pandemic in Lutherton, they would have daily and then weekly phone calls with several pastors, the managers of local manufacturing plants, and elected officials about how to address the crisis, right? Pastors are civic leaders in that community. Labor leaders are civic and political leaders in my Democratic field site. That kind of integration of civil society as this like layer of stability, organizations that are routinely offering a voice that can help people feel a little bit insulated from that pressure I described before, which makes them feel like my community is dying and no one is giving me a solution to it. Providing that solution in a coherent way, routinely saying, this is what we're doing, this is why we think it works, we're here and we're not going anywhere. I think that's really, really important. Hard to do, but important.
Thank you. The second question is from Edward, and he said, looking at your data, it looks like the focus is whether or how Democrats project respect for work and commit to policies that reward work, and that's different from redistribution, the basically taking tax dollars and helping people just survive through whatever sorts of subsidies they have. So he asks, should respect for work and rewarding work be foremost rather than the redistributive role of government? If government is going to play a role, should the focus be on things that help people help themselves, like job training and vocational tech, or help owning a home and building wealth? So those are the kind of questions around pre-distribution versus redistribution from Edward.
Yeah, great question, Edward. I mean, I think I'll maybe kind of take that question from two different perspectives. So one is the perspective of what my interviewees said to me. What Isaac was talking about and what Danielle was talking about was certainly redistribution, right? Isaac was explicitly saying, we need to tax higher income people more, and we need to make it so that the elderly don't have to choose between healthcare and housing, right? And actually throughout our conversations, Isaac was very concerned with redistribution. The 2017 tax cuts were like a real kind of bee in his bonnet, and indicative of the fact that the Republicans used government to make the rich richer and Democrats used it to redistribute. Danielle was talking about the same things, right? She was saying, we have these rich people, and if we could just fix this inequality, then we could have better healthcare, we could have better housing, which is a redistributive logic. She's not explicitly saying the government should do that, but and that was really what I heard throughout my conversations in Motorville, was like, we need to have this redistributive logic of government. I think from the point of, and that was from residents, I would say, people who weren't involved in community leadership. From the point of view of community leaders, I think they viewed their role as the kind of pre-distributive thing, as protecting the good union jobs, right? That's particularly because local governments don't do a lot of redistribution, and they actually can pull several levers that help support union labor. And so they can do things like sign project labor agreements, they can award local government contracts to unionized employers. So there's a lot that they can do, and that's the kinds of policies that organized labor was actively involved in at the local level. And so when community leaders thought about their role, they thought very much about like protecting good union jobs, I would say, and not just any jobs. Like they wanted good jobs that paid a wage that would prevent the need for redistribution, to your point. From your other question, though, is like, which should Democrats focus on? I think that when you think about the first part of the equation, which is just like being really concerned about inequality and wanting the government to do something to address it, whether that's pre-distribution or redistribution, I kind of think people are, I mean, like, I think there's like dignity in work and that everyone wants to work. And I've encountered people who've been on welfare programs and who haven't been able to work. And that is really often devastating for them and their families. And so I think people are aware that you need that social safety net in case you can't work, but that more broadly, if the Democrats say, here's the two ways that government can address this inequality we're all worried about, one way is to this kind of pre-distributive function, and the other way is this redistributive function. I think that kind of satisfies the sort of ask that we're hearing from in Motorville.
Great, thanks. Okay, I'm gonna go to Bruce. Thanks for your patience. And Stephanie, since we are coming up on the hour, are you able to stay a little longer if there's people who want to stay on and ask more questions? Great, thanks.
So this is probably an unfair question, Stephanie, because you've talked with us about this for around an hour. But if I were to say to you, Stephanie, how would you summarize the reasons why individuals have different perceptions of the two parties, assuming that the demographics are basically comparable and there's not an obvious sort of objective variable? So what would you say?
I think it all has to do with local context and the local organizations that are in that context. That's sort of the broad argument of the book. In this conversation, I've talked to you a lot about unions and churches, right? That the big source of variation that we know between why people affiliate with different political parties or think the parties mean different things, to your point, is really like demographic characteristics. People tend to want to affiliate with the party that represents people like them. And so if you're a different kind of person, you prefer a different party, right? But holding that constant, assuming that we're two similar kinds of people, my argument is that we might choose a different party because either we belong to a different organization that's actually telling us, no, it's this other party that represents your kind of people, or actually the organization could tell us, you're actually a different kind of person, right? Like I can think of myself in tons of different ways, even though I have a certain set of objective demographic characteristics, I can subjectively think about myself differently, and organizations tell us that, right? They tell us who we are, and they can also tell us which party best represents us. And I think they're most important actually for people who are kind of cross-pressured. So for example, we know that African Americans are essentially the most politically homogenous voting group in the country, and they're overwhelmingly Democratic, right? So Republicans don't spend a lot of time trying to attract new African American voters because that's quite costly. And so they're not being appealed to by both parties. But the people I interviewed in my book, sort of white working middle class voters, we know, or we wouldn't be on this call, that both parties are trying to cultivate ties with that group, right? And so that's where organizations can kind of say, both parties want you. This is why you should want the Democrats, or this is why you should want the Republicans.
Oops. Okay, thanks. Kevin.
Yeah, thanks. Just got your book, so I'm just digging in. So I really appreciated the talk today. But I wonder if you could help me make sense of this. So I'm from Iowa. Cedar Rapids, Iowa. We have what they call pivot counties. 31 counties went Obama and then went Trump, and a bunch of them in this district. I think about 20 of them up in Northeast Iowa, which is where I'm from. All right, so that's one thing. Second thing is when I take my dog for a walk, there's a guy that has a big sticker on the back of his car that's always made me wonder to knock on his door and ask him this question. But the sticker says, "We the people are pissed off," and I'm like, why is this guy pissed off? Because he's got a nice house, nice car, he's got a good job. And then I hear somebody say, the top 1% should be giving to charity rather than asking for charity with big tax cuts. And so, where does that all fit into kind of your study?
Okay. I feel like that was a lot of like punch in that question. So I will try to get all of it. So the first thing about those pivot counties, the perspective that I take in the book, and like generally my perspective on politics, is that those pivot counties are a little misleading. Obama was like an immensely popular president. He won a lot of people and a lot of places that your kind of average Democrat wouldn't win. So like, you know how they talk about the rookie baseball year and then the regression to the mean, and then they're like, oh my gosh, that person is failing. And they're like, actually, no, they're still having a pretty good year. They just weren't this all-star. Obama was a Democratic all-star. So comparing anything to the Obama years is not very useful when we think about what change matters. That was why in the first slide or the second slide, I showed you that figure going all the way back to the 1960s. So when we look at this in a broader historical perspective, we can see that 2/3 of that original group of white working class Democratic counties from the 30s and 40s, they were gone by 1968 and they were not coming back. They were firmly Republican and they became even more Republican by the early 2000s, right? And so that's actually, when we talk about sort of this breakdown of working class politics, that's like the big move right there, right? The Obama-Trump counties were probably that green line, which wasn't actually, like, again, they weren't really Obama-Trump counties. They had a bump for Obama. They were really competitive to both parties. They were kind of swing counties. They bumped up for Obama, and then they bumped really far down for Trump. What's happened with those counties is that they've stayed down. They've stayed Republican. And so when we think about kind of contemporary politics, we're looking at, like, not why did some places go from Obama to Trump. We really need to be thinking about, why did some places go from pretty open to both parties, like swing counties, swing states, to firmly Republican in 2016? And I think that the answer is some of the anger that you're talking about. That's the sort of Scott story, right? The Scott story. And to your point about this kind of like puzzle of like, why would a sort of financially secure person be angry like that? A lot of what I observed in the town where Scott lives is that I heard that same anger. And I don't know the context of Cedar Rapids very well, so this might not be the case in Cedar Rapids, but this town had lost so much that even the people who were personally financially stable. So Scott, for example, had a great job with the county. I went to his house, lovely house, like beautiful rural setting, surrounded by corn and bean fields. You know, he has secure employment. He's approaching retirement. He's not worried about his own material decline, but he's watched basically like the roll up of, you know, rural America all around him. And it's been sort of emotionally devastating. And so I think people in that town aren't always worried just about themselves. They're worried about the broader loss of a whole kind of way of life that they grew up with and they thought would be there for their kids. And now their kids, rather than saying, yeah, I'm going to do this with my kids, they're saying, well, I'm going to go to college and I'm going to move to Iowa City or Minneapolis or Milwaukee, because that's where I can get a job that will compensate me for this college degree. And I think that's just it's a real feeling of loss, even if it's not necessarily a financial loss.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going to just tag on to that too, because we had a previous speaker, one of the authors of The Rural Voter. It was either Dan Shea or Nick Jacobs or both of them. And in that book, they talk about this concept of shared fate that's really strong, particularly in rural communities. Goes to that. So a couple people in the chat have been asking about the role of media. And of course, it's, it's very right-wing dominated media in a lot of these communities. So what was your take on how big a role that's playing in driving people's vote choices? And is it the case that it's playing a bigger role where there's the civic vacuum?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so I think one thing that we know very firmly in American politics is that people tend to vote with their political party. So like about 90% of people in every election are going to vote as Republicans if they think of themselves as Republicans. They're going to vote as Democrats if they think of themselves as Democrats. And so I think for most people, the media isn't necessarily driving their vote choice. Their vote choice is kind of almost predetermined. The media is sometimes making people have, I would say, more extreme opinions. And I think that's the feeling that we have when we're like, oh my gosh, polarization is crazy in this country. I think what we're feeling is that, some people, like taking the COVID-19 pandemic as an example, some people are saying we should never reopen the schools. We should, this is all hyperbole, but we should never reopen the schools. We should mask forever. We should all stay locked down for years. And other people are saying we should not close anything down from day one. And, we should go out and do these things. And like, you can have this feeling that people are living in two different realities. And I think that feeling is exacerbated by the media, because the media is sort of telling you, giving you a different narrative about how to think about these particularly new issues. I think they play a really big role in, and it can kind of create these really rapidly divergent opinions. And I talk about this in the last chapter of the book, actually. about the COVID-19 pandemic, because I watched this happen in real time as I was re-interviewing people from March to November of 2020. Closures happened and everyone was just scared. It was the same thing I was saying with healthcare. Everyone had the same worries, right? They were like, this is really scary. I don't think I need to remind anyone in this room. It was scary. Everyone was scared. It wasn't partisan. We were scared. By April, 6 weeks later, states were debating kind of the reopening measures, if you all remember that. And already there was this massive divergence in partisan opinions on reopening, particularly among people who watched kind of partisan news in the evenings. And it happened really quickly. And by the November election, it felt like those two groups of people, if they watched partisan news, were living in totally alternate realities about the pandemic. It was like whiplash going from one phone call to the other. And so I think it plays a really important role the media plays a really important role in preventing consensus on issues where we might otherwise be able to agree, but less so in vote choice, actually.
That's really interesting. I've never heard anyone draw that distinction in terms of the role of media. So thank you for that. Okay, Murray, thank you for being patient. You can go ahead and ask your question now.
All right, thanks very much. Thanks for being here. I was going to ask about the media and about priming people to think a certain way because that's what they have. But the other part of my question is there's information coming out right now that what we're dealing with Trump is actually a patrimonial leader. And that's based on what we see with Putin, Orban, people like that. And it's not so much people that rule, but we have a ruler, a person that does those things. And our laws and our rules kind of fade to the background, and we end up with like personal connections. Like people are concerned, I think, about we have billionaires in the cabinet. And so they're the ones that the voice